At 2:14 p.m., my phone buzzed with a single automated text. Demolition scheduled. The $840,000 storefront I owned free and clear was being transferred at midnight. I called my father. My mother answered with a whisper. We made the hard choice. Family survives together. I sat in my truck for a long time after the line went dead. The engine was still running, the heater blowing dry air against my face, and outside the windshield, the Seattle drizzle was turning the pavement a slick, bruised gray. My grandfather had left that building to me when I was 24. He bypassed my parents entirely, transferring the deed into a standalone trust with my name as the sole beneficiary, because he knew exactly who they were. He knew they viewed history, sentiment, and stability as liquid assets waiting to be tapped. He had spent 50 years running a hardware store out of that brick building, and when he handed me the keys, his hands were trembling, rough with calluses. He told me to keep it. He told me it was my anchor in a world that would constantly try to pull me adrift. For the last 3 years, I hadn't even leased the commercial space out. I had been slowly, painstakingly renovating it into a graphic design studio. I spent my weekends sanding the original hardwood floors, breathing in a century of dust, pulling down drywall to expose the brick underneath. It was mine. The only thing in my life that felt entirely solid. You don't immediately jump to the conclusion that your own flesh and blood has committed federal fraud to steal from you. You tell yourself it's a glitch in the county's automated system. You tell yourself the city planning department mislabeled a parcel number for a development down the block. But the silence on my mother's end of the phone, that hollow, calculated pause before she delivered her line about family survival, dismantled every rationalization I had. I put the truck in gear and drove downtown to the county records office. I didn't speed. I didn't run any red lights. The anger hadn't reached my chest yet. It was still a cold, heavy stone sitting at the base of my throat. The clerk behind the glass was a guy named Marcus. He had the tired, heavily lined face of a man who spent 40 hours a week explaining zoning laws to angry contractors. He slid a piece of paper across the counter, asking for the parcel number. I gave it to him. He typed it in, his eyes scanning the ancient cart monitor on his desk. There's a warranty deed here, Marcus said, his voice completely flat. Filed electronically 5 days ago. Looks like an expedited transfer to a commercial holding group. Escrow is scheduled to clear at midnight. Print it, I said. He hit a button, and the laser printer behind him groaned to life. When he handed me the pages, I stared at the signature line. It was my name. The digital signature was flawless, matching my driver's license on file perfectly. But it wasn't my IP address. I didn't sign this, I told him. My voice sounded strange, detached. Who submitted the transfer? Marcus frowned. He tapped his keyboard a few more times, pulling up the routing metadata for the electronic filing. The county had moved to an automated system 2 years ago to speed up property sales, allowing authorized users to bypass in-person notary requirements if they could pass a two-factor authentication check tied to the property's tax records. Marcus's eyes narrowed as he read the screen. The rhythmic clicking of his keyboard stopped entirely. The secondary authorization email, Marcus said, turning the heavy monitor slightly so I could see the screen. It was routed through an old AOL address. Does that look familiar? It was my childhood email, the one I used in middle school to register for message boards. But that wasn't the detail that made my stomach bottom out. It was the recovery phone number listed next to the verification logs. The system had sent a text message with a 6-digit code to authorize the transfer, and the number ended in 8842. It was Silas. My older brother Silas was supposed to be in Dubai. 3 years ago, he had fled the country to escape a 6-figure hole he'd dug himself into with a syndicate of offshore sportsbooks. He had always been a ghost of a person, drifting in and out of our lives only when he needed money, leaving behind a wake of overdraft fees and stolen electronics. My parents had sworn they were done with him. They had sat in my living room, weeping, promising they had changed their phone numbers and locked their credit. They lied. He hadn't stayed in Dubai. He had slinked back, and instead of turning him away, my parents had quietly handed him the only thing of value left in our family, my building. The money, I said, looking back up at Marcus. The sale price. It's $840,000. Has it moved? Not yet, Marcus said, his tone shifting from bureaucratic indifference to quiet alarm. The funds are sitting in an escrow account. The developer put a hold on the release, pending a final environmental inspection this morning. If the inspection clears, the money transfers at midnight, and the demolition permits go live. I didn't leave the building. I walked down the hall to the county courthouse and filed an emergency injunction. I stood in front of a duty judge for 10 minutes, presented my actual ID, the property tax receipts I had paid for the last 5 years, and the metadata Marcus had printed out. The judge signed the freeze order immediately. From there, I walked to the police precinct 3 blocks away and filed a report for cyber fraud and identity theft. I named my mother, my father, and my brother. I didn't hesitate. I didn't feel a shred of guilt. I just filled out the paperwork, handed it to the desk sergeant, and walked back out into the rain. By the time I got home, the fallout had begun. My phone was filled with voicemails. The developer, discovering the fraudulent title, had immediately sued my parents for breach of contract, because my parents were the ones who had physically signed the initial brokering agreement on Silas's behalf. Acting as his representatives, they were legally on the hook. My mother left 3 messages. The first was pleading, asking me to drop the injunction, explaining that Silas owed dangerous people money and that this was the only way to save his life. The second was angry, calling me selfish for prioritizing a dusty old brick box over my own brother's safety. The third was just hyperventilating panic. I didn't call her back. I ordered takeout, sat on my couch, and stared at the wall. I thought it was over. I thought the asset was frozen, the fraud was exposed, and all I had to do was wait for the legal machinery to grind them down. Then, the next morning, Marcus called me. Hey, he said. He sounded entirely different than he had the day before. He sounded tired. You need to come back down here. When I arrived at his counter, he already had a thick manila folder sitting on the laminate surface. The developer's environmental inspector went out to your property yesterday morning, before the injunction hit, Marcus explained, keeping his voice low. Standard procedure for a commercial demolition. They look for asbestos, lead paint, old buried hazards, and, I asked, and they ran a ground-penetrating radar scan on the empty lot behind the building, Marcus said. He opened the folder. They found a 500-gallon underground heating oil tank buried near the foundation line. Looks like it's been there since the 70s. Okay, I said, confused. It's an old building. We can get a remediation crew to pump it out and remove it. It's expensive, but it's not the end of the world. That's not the problem, Marcus said. He slid a yellowed, carbon copy document across the counter. It was a municipal abatement permit from 1998, back when the city first required commercial properties to register underground tanks. When the inspector found the tank, they pulled the historical permit to see if it had ever been been decommissioned. It wasn't. But look at the signature on the registration. I looked down. There were 2 signatures on the line for the property owner. One was my grandfather's, instantly recognizable with its sharp slanted loops. The second signature belonged to someone named Vivian Harlow. Who is Vivian Harlow? I asked, a cold knot forming in my stomach. I dug into the archives this morning, Marcus said gently. Your grandfather owned the building. Yes, but in the late 90s, during a county border rezoning, he used the property as collateral for a private business loan to keep the hardware store afloat. The title search the developer ran last week was sloppy. They only looked at the primary electronic deed. They missed a secondary lien and a partial deed transfer recorded in paper files. Marcus tapped the name on the page. Your grandfather never paid off the loan. When he transferred the deed to you, he only transferred his share. Vivian Harlow was his silent partner. Legally, her estate owns 49% of that building. You don't have a free and clear title. You never did. I just stared at the faded blue ink on the page. The foundation of everything I thought I owned was fracturing. My grandfather, the man who warned me never to trust my parents with assets, had handed me a poisoned chalice. Where is Vivian Harlow now? I asked. She passed away 6 years ago, Marcus said. Her estate is managed by a local commercial trust. And because the developer's lawyers are currently tearing apart every piece of paperwork tied to this property to build their lawsuit against your parents, the trust has been notified. They know about the intended sale, and they want their half. I walked out of the records office feeling completely hollowed out. The victory I thought I had secured yesterday had evaporated. I wasn't just fighting my family anymore. I was about to be dragged into a massive probate war with a commercial trust over a building that wasn't even entirely mine. When I pulled up to my apartment complex, I just wanted to sleep. I wanted to turn off my phone and disappear for a week. But as I walked up the exterior stairs to my unit, I saw a figure sitting on the concrete landing in front of my door. He was wearing a wrinkled windbreaker, his shoulders hunched, staring at the wet pavement between his shoes. He looked thinner than I remembered, his hair thinning, his skin carrying that gray, translucent quality that comes from severe, prolonged stress. He didn't look like a criminal mastermind who had successfully forged federal documents. He just looked pathetic. Silas looked up as I reached the landing. He didn't stand up. He just let out a long, shaky breath. They gave me $50,000, he said, his voice barely a rasp. He didn't say hello. He didn't apologize. Who? I asked, stopping a few feet away from him. My keys tight in my hand. The developer, Silas said, rubbing his face with shaking hands. When Mom and Dad signed the preliminary brokering agreement for the sale, the developer fronted them a $50,000 earnest money deposit to clear the escrow process faster. Mom gave it straight to me. I wired it to the guys I owe. It bought me a week. I stared at him, trying to process the sheer scale of the mess my parents had created. The sale is frozen, Silas. It's not going through. Not only is it fraudulent, but there's a clouded title. We don't even own the whole building. I know, Silas whispered. He finally looked up at me, his eyes bloodshot and terrified. The developer called Mom an hour ago. Since the sale is void, they want the $50,000 back, immediately, plus damages. Then Mom and Dad can pay it, I said coldly. They dug the hole. They don't have it, Silas said, his voice cracking. They remortgaged their house 2 years ago to pay off a different debt of mine. They have nothing left in savings. If they don't return the earnest money by Friday, the developer is going to refer the fraud to the federal prosecutor, on top of the civil suit. He slowly pushed himself up from the concrete, leaning heavily against the railing. He smelled like stale airport coffee and panic sweat. The guys I owe, Silas continued, his voice dropping to a desperate whisper. $50,000 only covered the interest. I still owe the principal. And if the federal prosecutor starts digging into Mom and Dad's finances, they're going to find out exactly where that wire transfer went. They're going to find the syndicate. He looked at my front door, then back at me. I can't go to prison, man, and if the syndicate thinks I'm bringing federal heat down on them, I won't even make it to a cell. You have to sell the building. You have to work a deal with this Vivian Harlow estate and push the sale through legally. It's the only way. The only way to what? I snapped, the anger finally breaking through the cold detachment. To save you from your own consequences? Why should I give up the only thing I have to fix your mistakes? Because if you don't, Silas said, his eyes welling with tears, he immediately blinked away. Mom and Dad are going to take the fall for the forgery. They'll go to federal prison, and you'll be the one who put them there. I looked at him, really looked at him. The sheer audacity of the manipulation actually made me laugh, a short, harsh sound that echoed off the wet concrete of the breezeway. I put them there? I asked, my voice dropping to a dead, flat calm. I forged a federal warranty deed. I bypassed a 2-factor authentication system. I took a $50,000 cash advance on a property I didn't own and wired it to a sportsbook. Is that what I did, Silas? He flinched, shrinking back against the metal railing. You know what I mean. You have the power to fix this. You're the only one who can. No, I said, stepping past him and sliding my key into the deadbolt. I don't. You made a bet, Silas. Mom and Dad backed it. Now the house is collecting. That has absolutely nothing to do with me. I turned the key, pushed the door open, and stepped inside. They're going to lose the house, Silas yelled, his voice cracking as he grabbed the edge of the doorframe to keep me from shutting it. If they have to pay back the earnest money and the legal fees, they'll be on the street. They're in their 60s. Are you really going to let them go homeless over a brick building you don't even use? I looked down at his hand gripping my doorframe. His knuckles were white. Move your hand, Silas, please, he begged, the anger evaporating back into that pathetic, cloying desperation. Just talk to the Vivian Harlow Trust. Work out a split. If we can just push the sale through, everyone walks away clean. You still get half. $400,000. That's life-changing money. Why isn't that enough for you? Move your hand, I repeated, or I'm calling the police and having you arrested for trespassing on top of the identity theft. He stared at me for a long second, searching my face for any hesitation, any crack of familial guilt he could pry open. He found nothing. He slowly pulled his hand back, stepping away into the rain. I shut the door in his face and threw the deadbolt. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my kitchen island with a cold cup of coffee, watching the digital clock on the microwave flip through the early morning hours. My phone stayed completely silent. My mother didn't call. My father didn't call. They had sent Silas as their emissary, their final guilt trip, and when that failed, they had nothing left. They were finally out of moves, but I was still trapped on the board. At 8 a.m., I opened my laptop and started searching for Vivian Harlow. Marcus had mentioned her estate was managed by a local commercial trust. It took me 20 minutes of digging through the county's online probate records to find the name, Halvorsen and Strand Fiduciary Services. They had an office in Bellevue, just across the lake. I didn't call ahead. I just took a shower, put on a clean shirt, and drove over. The office was exactly what you'd expect from a firm that managed dead people's money. It was sterile, quiet, and smelled faintly of lemon polish and expensive carpet. The receptionist looked mildly annoyed when I walked in without an appointment, but the moment I gave her the parcel number for for the studio and mentioned the Harlow estate. Her demeanor shifted. She picked up her phone, spoke in a hushed tone, and 5 minutes later, I was sitting in a glass-walled conference room. A woman walked in carrying a thick, expandable file folder. She looked to be in her late 50s, wearing a sharp navy blazer and wire-rimmed glasses. She didn't offer to shake my hand. She just sat down across the polished mahogany table and set the folder down with a heavy thud. "I'm Ingrid," she said, her tone brisk and entirely devoid of warmth. "I manage the Harlow Trust. I assume you're the grandson." "I am," I said. "I'm assuming you know why I'm here. I know that a rapid development firm tried to buy a piece of commercial real estate yesterday," Ingrid said, opening the folder and extracting a stack of stapled documents. "I know that the title transfer was flagged for fraud, and I know that the developer's lawyers sent my office an aggressive cease and desist letter at 6 o'clock last night, demanding to know why we held an undisclosed 49% stake in a property they had just paid $50,000 in earnest money to acquire." She looked up at me, her eyes entirely unreadable. "What I don't know is why you let this go so far before contacting us. I didn't know you existed until yesterday," I said honestly. "My grandfather left me the deed. He never mentioned a silent partner. He never mentioned Vivian Harlow." Ingrid let out a slow, deliberate breath. "Your grandfather was a proud man, and proud men rarely like to admit when they've been saved." She tapped the documents. "In 1998, your grandfather's hardware store was completely insolvent. The bank was threatening foreclosure. Vivian Harlow was his bookkeeper. She had inherited a significant amount of money from her late husband, and she offered to pay off the bank loan to keep the store open. In exchange, your grandfather signed over 49% of the property's equity." "Okay," I said, trying to process the fact that my grandfather's legacy was built on a bailout. "So the trust owns half. I want to buy you out. I don't know how much the property is actually worth right now, but I can get a loan against my half of the equity." Ingrid didn't smile, but the corner of her mouth twitched in a way that felt distinctly like pity. "You can't buy us out, and even if you could, we wouldn't let you, because the property is practically worthless." I stared at her. "The developer offered $840,000 for it. The developer offered that based on a clean environmental bill of health and a clear title," Ingrid corrected, leaning forward. "Did the county clerk tell you about the 500-gallon heating oil tank buried behind the foundation?" "He said the inspector found it yesterday. He said it was from the 70s. Did he tell you what else the inspector found?" My stomach turned over. "No." Ingrid pulled a piece of paper from the file and slid it across the table. It was a digital copy of an environmental impact report, stamped with yesterday's date. "Heating oil tanks from the 70s were made of bare steel," Ingrid explained, her voice taking on the clinical tone of a surgeon delivering a bad prognosis. "They were buried directly in the soil. Over 50 years, that steel corrodes. The inspector didn't just find a tank. He found a massive soil anomaly on the ground penetrating radar. The tank ruptured years ago. Hundreds of gallons of heavy heating oil have leached into the surrounding soil, right up against the municipal sewer main." I looked at the report. I didn't understand the chemical abbreviations, but I understood the bright red warning labels plastered across the bottom of the page. "The developer pulled their offer this morning," Ingrid said. "They are entirely walking away from the purchase. They don't just want their $50,000 back from your parents, they are washing their hands of the parcel completely. Because by ordering that inspection, they legally triggered a mandatory reporting requirement to the Department of Ecology." The cold, heavy stone in my throat dropped straight into my gut. "A mandatory report." "Yes," Ingrid said. "The city now knows the soil is heavily contaminated. The site is a registered environmental hazard. You can't sell it. You can't lease it. You can't even occupy it for commercial use until it undergoes a full municipal abatement." "How much?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "To excavate the tank, remove the contaminated soil, reinforce the municipal sewer main, and pass the EPA inspection?" Ingrid adjusted her glasses. "200, maybe $250,000. Minimum." I sat back in my chair. The glass walls of the conference room suddenly felt like they were pressing in on me. The air in the room was too thin, and since the fraudulent sale was voided, Ingrid continued relentlessly, "Your parents aren't the legal owners. Silas isn't the legal owner. You are. You hold the primary deed. The Department of Ecology will be issuing the cleanup mandate to you." My family hadn't just tried to steal my building. In their blind, greedy rush to liquidate my grandfather's legacy and save my brother, they had armed a financial landmine, and when the sale fell apart, they had handed it right back to me, perfectly timed to detonate. "What about the trust?" I asked, grasping at anything. "You own 49%. You're liable for half the cleanup." "Read the original contract," Ingrid said, sliding a heavily yellowed piece of paper across the table. She pointed to a highlighted paragraph near the bottom. "Vivian Harlow was a smart woman. When she bought her stake, she included an indemnification clause. The trust holds equity in the structure and the land, but all maintenance, liabilities, and municipal fines are the sole responsibility of the primary deed holder. Your grandfather signed it. It's ironclad." She closed the folder. "We will not be contributing a dime to the abatement, and until the abatement is finished, the property has a negative market value. We won't sell our shares to you because they are currently worth less than zero. We will simply wait for you to pay for the cleanup. If you can't pay it, the city will place a lien on the property, seize it, and auction it. At that point, the trust will write off the loss." Ingrid stood up, smoothing the front of her blazer. "I am sorry for your situation, but fiduciary duty requires me to protect the assets of the estate, and right now, your building is a toxic liability. Have a good afternoon." She walked out of the room, leaving me alone at the table. I didn't move for a long time. I just looked out the window at the Bellevue skyline, watching the gray clouds stack up against the glass. The $840,000 asset I thought was my anchor was gone. In its place was a $250,000 federal cleanup bill with my name on it. If I didn't pay it, I would lose the building to the city. If I tried to pay it, it would bankrupt me. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out. It wasn't Silas. It wasn't my mother or my father. It was a local Seattle number I didn't recognize. I stared at it for 4 rings before I finally swiped to answer, bringing the phone to my ear without saying a word. "Is this the owner of the commercial property on 4th Avenue? A man's voice asked. It was a sharp, clipped voice, layered over the low hum of traffic. "Who is this?" I asked. "My name is Duncan Mercer," the man said. "I represent a private investment group. We understand your deal with the rapid development firm fell through this morning due to an environmental complication. We also understand that your family is currently facing a rather urgent liquidity crisis regarding a $50,000 deposit." I sat up straight, my grip tightening on the phone. "How do you know about the deposit?" "We know a lot of things," Duncan Mercer said smoothly. "We know about the underground tank, we know about the Vivian Harlow Trust, and we know about the syndicate your brother is currently hiding from." There was a brief pause, filled only with the sound of a siren passing in the background on his end. "We are prepared to take the proper property off your hands, Duncan continued. We will assume full liability for the environmental cleanup. We will handle the Harlow Trust, and we will clear the $50,000 debt your parents owe the developer, which keeps them out of federal prison. What's the catch? I asked, my voice hard. People don't just eat a $250,000 cleanup bill out of the goodness of their hearts. No, they don't, Duncan agreed. The catch is the purchase price. We aren't offering $840,000. We are offering exactly $1. You sign over the primary deed, you walk away with nothing, and your family's legal and physical threats disappear. And if I say no? If you say no, Duncan said, his tone perfectly pleasant, we buy the $50,000 debt from the developer this afternoon. We assume the position of the creditor, and then we start making phone calls to the people your brother owes money to, letting them know exactly where he's staying. I didn't answer immediately. I just listened to the faint ambient noise on his end of the line, the hiss of tires on wet asphalt, a distant siren. My brain was moving fast, stripping away the panic his threat was designed to induce, leaving only the cold, hard math of the situation. You're a distressed asset fund, I said. We are a private investment group, Duncan replied, his voice smooth. Call yourselves whatever you want, I told him. But you want a commercial property valued at over $800,000. Even with a $250,000 cleanup bill, there's over $500,000 of equity sitting on that lot. And you want me to hand it to you for $1 because you think I'm terrified of what happens to my brother. Duncan chuckled, a dry, thin sound that barely carried over the phone. I think you're a pragmatist, and I think you know your parents are facing federal wire fraud charges if that $50,000 earnest money isn't returned to the developer by Friday. If you buy that debt, I said, keeping my voice dead level, you're out $50,000. If you call my brother's bookies, they'll find him. They might put him in a hospital, or they might put him in the ground, but none of those things actually puts my grandfather's deed in your hands. It just makes you a creditor, holding a worthless IOU, chasing a gambling addict who doesn't have a dime to his name. You want the building, Duncan? Make me a real offer. Otherwise, stop wasting my time. The silence on the line stretched out, heavy and thick. I had called his bluff, at least the part that mattered to his bottom line. We are not in the business of negotiating over toxic dirt, Duncan said, the pleasantness completely gone from his voice. You have until tomorrow morning to accept the buyout. After that, we buy the developer's debt, and we let the chips fall on your family. He hung up. I lowered the phone and stared at the dark screen. The air in my truck felt suffocating. I rolled down the window, letting the cold, damp Seattle air wash over my face, and put the truck in drive. I didn't head back to my apartment. I merged onto I-5 and drove north toward Shoreline, to the 3-bedroom ranch house where I had grown up. I hadn't been there in 8 months. There was a time when I would have tried to handle this over the phone, trying to maintain some protective distance from the sheer force of my parents' delusions, but not today. Today, the distance was gone. I pulled into the driveway. The lawn was overgrown, the gutters overflowing with dead pine needles. I walked up to the front door and let myself in with the spare key I kept on my ring. The house smelled like stale potpourri and closed windows. My mother was sitting at the kitchen table, a half-empty mug of tea in front of her, staring blankly at a daytime talk show playing on the small television on the counter. My father was pacing the length of the living room, a cordless phone pressed to his ear, arguing with someone in a low, furious whisper. When he saw me standing in the entryway, he froze. He ended the call without saying goodbye and slowly lowered the phone. My mother turned around in her chair. Her eyes were red-rimmed and swollen, but the moment she saw me, her posture stiffened. She didn't look relieved. She looked defensive. Where is Silas? My mother asked. Not hello, not an apology for trying to steal my future. Just Silas. He's hiding, I said, walking into the kitchen and standing across the table from her, which is exactly what you should be doing, considering the developer's lawyers are drafting a civil suit against you as we speak. We didn't have a choice, my father said, stepping into the kitchen, his voice carrying that familiar, hollow authority he always tried to project when he was dead wrong. Silas came to us in trouble, real trouble. Those people he owes money to are dangerous. We had to liquidate the asset to protect family. It wasn't your asset to liquidate, I said, my voice rising, despite my efforts to keep it flat. It was mine. Grandpa left it to me, and you forged my signature on federal documents to steal it. It's just a building. My mother snapped, slamming her hand flat against the table, rattling the tea mug. It's just bricks and wood. You were letting it sit empty while your own brother was facing literal death threats. How selfish can you be? If you had just let the sale go through, Silas would be safe. We would have paid off the mortgage, and you still would have gotten a share of whatever was left. The sheer, breathtaking entitlement of it hit me like a physical blow. They had rationalized it completely. In their minds, I was the villain for getting in the way of their theft. The sale isn't going through, I said, watching the color slowly drain from my mother's face. The developer backed out this morning. Completely. My father stopped breathing for a second. What do you mean they backed out? The escrow is just frozen. We just need you to drop the injunction. There is no escrow, I told them, enunciating every word so there was no room for their usual mental gymnastics. The environmental inspector found a ruptured heating oil tank from the 70s buried under the foundation. The soil is contaminated. The site is a registered environmental hazard. The developer pulled their offer, and because they pulled it, the preliminary contract you signed is void. The only thing that isn't void is the $50,000 earnest money deposit they gave you. The deposit you gave to Silas. The silence in the kitchen was absolute. The daytime talk show chattered cheerfully in the background, a bizarre soundtrack to the total collapse of my parents' lives. No, my mother whispered, shaking her head in frantic, jerky movements. No, the developer has to buy it. We signed the papers. They don't have to buy anything, Mom. It's a toxic site. It's going to cost $250,000 to clean up the soil before the city even allows anyone to step foot inside it. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the back of a dining chair. The developer wants their $50,000 back by Friday, or they are handing the forged deed and the metadata logs over to the federal prosecutor, which means you and Dad are looking at 5 to 10 years in a federal penitentiary. My father slumped against the counter, running a trembling hand through his thinning hair. We don't have $50,000. We gave it all to Silas to pay off the syndicate's interest. I know, I said. And now there's a distressed asset fund circling the property. A guy named Duncan Mercer just called me. He offered to buy the $50,000 debt from the developer. If he does, he's going to hold it over our heads. He threatened to call the syndicate and tell them exactly where Silas is hiding, unless I sign the building over to him for $1. My mother looked up at me, her eyes wide with terror, but also with a sudden, desperate spark of hope. You can do that, she breathed. You can sign it over. If you sign it over, this man pays off the debt. Silas is safe. We stay out of prison. You just have to give him the deed. I stared at the woman who raised me. I looked at the desperate pleading calculation in her eyes, realizing that there was absolutely no bottom to what she would ask me to sacrifice for her and my brother. No, I said. My mother blinked. What do you mean no? It's a toxic building. You just said it's worthless. Sign it over. I mean no, Mom, I said, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. I am not handing over my grandfather's legacy to a vulture fund to buy you out of a federal crime you committed against me. You dug this hole. You forged the documents. You took the money. You fix it. We are your parents. My father yelled, his face turning a mottled red as he pushed himself off the counter. We clothed you. We fed you. You owe us. I owe you nothing, I said, turning my back on them and walking toward the front door. You have until Friday to find 50 grand. I suggest you start calling real estate agents about this house. I walked out, shutting the front door behind me just as my mother started to sob. I drove straight to downtown Seattle. I needed a lawyer, not the duty judge at the courthouse, not the police, but someone who actually understood commercial real estate and environmental liabilities. I spent 30 minutes sitting in my truck in a paid parking lot, scrolling through legal directories on my phone until I found a firm that specialized in municipal property disputes. An hour later, I was sitting in the cramped, paper-cluttered office of Miriam Voss. She was a sharp-featured woman in her 40s who looked like she ran on black coffee and spite. I laid the entire mess out on her desk: the forged deed, the Vivian Harlow Trust, the environmental report, and the phone call from Duncan Mercer. Miriam read through the documents in complete silence, her pen tapping a steady, rhythmic beat against her legal pad. When she finally looked up, she didn't offer any comforting platitudes. Your family is a nightmare, Miriam said bluntly. I'm aware, I said. The distressed asset guy, Duncan Mercer, Miriam continued, tapping the environmental report. He's not bluffing about buying the debt. That's a standard pressure tactic for shadow equity firms. But you were right to call his bluff on the value. He wants this property because even with the abatement costs, it's located in a prime zoning corridor. If he gets it for $1, he clears a massive profit margin. So what do I do? I asked. The trust won't pay for the cleanup because of the indemnification clause my grandfather signed. I don't have $250,000, and I refuse to bail my parents out by giving the building to Mercer. Miriam leaned back in her chair, steepling her fingers. The indemnification clause is tight. Vivian Harlow had a very good lawyer in 1998. The trust is shielded from all municipal liabilities. However, she paused, pulling the municipal plot map out from the stack of papers. There's a detail in this environmental report that changes the leverage. She spun the map around and pointed a manicured fingernail at the rear property line of the studio. The inspector noted that the heating oil tank ruptured near the foundation, Miriam said, tracing a red dotted line on the map. But look at the property survey. The tank wasn't entirely buried on your grandfather's land. The rear 20% of the tank crosses over the property line into the municipal alleyway. I frowned, leaning closer to the map. What does that mean? It means, Miriam said, a slow, predatory smile spreading across her face, that while you and the trust own the building, the city of Seattle technically owns the back end of that tank. And under Washington state environmental law, liability for hazardous waste abatement isn't determined by who bought the property. It's determined by whose land the hazard occupies. The city is liable? I asked, feeling the first genuine spark of hope in 2 days. Partially, Miriam corrected. But more importantly, the Department of Ecology cannot mandate a private citizen to clean up a municipal hazard without offering a joint remediation grant. The city doesn't want to dig up that alleyway on their own dime. They want you to do it. She closed the file. I can file a petition tomorrow morning with the city's zoning board, forcing them to appraise the municipal portion of the contamination. It will stall the EPA mandate for at least 6 months, and it forces the Vivian Harlow Trust back to the table, because if the city gets involved, the city can place a municipal lien on the trust's equity. Can it stop Mercer? I asked. Mercer only has leverage if he can force a rapid transfer of the deed, Miriam said. If the deed is locked in a municipal zoning dispute, he can't touch it. It becomes legally radioactive. She looked at me, her expression turning serious. But this doesn't solve your parents' problem. The developer still wants their 50 grand by Friday. If they don't get it, your parents are going to be indicted for forgery. Are you prepared to let that happen? I looked at the plot map on her desk, tracing the lines of the building my grandfather had left me. The building my parents had tried to sell out from under me. File the petition, I said. Miriam didn't smile, but her eyes sharpened. She pulled a fresh legal pad from her desk drawer and clicked her pen. I need a $5,000 retainer to start, she said, her tone dropping back into pure clinical professionalism. That covers the initial filing, the zoning board petition, and my time spent pushing back against the developer's lawyers so they don't try to loop you into the civil suit against your parents. If the city fights the appraisal, or if Mercer's group tries to litigate the deed transfer, it will cost more. I pulled my wallet out of my back pocket and handed her my credit card. It was going to max out my limit, but I didn't care. It was the price of keeping my grandfather's shop out of my mother's hands and Mercer's portfolio. Miriam swiped the card on a small terminal plugged into her computer. I'll file the petition electronically before the courts close at 5. The moment it hits the docket, the EPA mandate is frozen. The city can't force you to clean up a municipal hazard without a joint survey, and the survey takes months to schedule. As for Mercer, if he buys that $50,000 debt, he's buying a ticket to the back of a very long, very bureaucratic line. And my parents? I asked. Miriam handed my card back along with a printed receipt. The developer's Friday deadline for the earnest money remains. That is entirely between your parents, Silas, and the holding company they defrauded. If I were you, I would block their numbers. They are about to enter the panic phase, and you do not want to be anywhere near the blast radius. I thanked her, took my receipt, and left the office. By the time I got back to my apartment, it was completely dark. The rain had stopped, but the air was still heavy and wet. I walked inside, dropped my keys in the bowl by the door, and took Miriam's advice. I pulled up my phone settings and blocked my mother's number. Then I blocked my father's. Then I blocked Silas's burner. I ordered a pizza I barely touched, drank 2 glasses of tap water, and fell asleep on the couch with my clothes still on. Thursday morning arrived with a hollow, ringing silence. My phone hadn't buzzed once. No texts, no voicemails. The block was working, but the quiet felt less like peace and more like the receding tide right before a tsunami hits. At 10:00 a.m., I drove down to the studio. I parked across the street and just looked at it. It was a beautiful, stubborn piece of early 20th century architecture. Red brick, tall, arched windows, and a heavy oak front door. My grandfather had spent half his life inside those walls, selling nails and lumber, giving credit to people who couldn't pay, building a quiet, decent life. I crossed the street and unlocked the front door. The air inside smelled like sawdust and old paper. The hardwood floors I had spent months restoring gleamed faintly in the gray morning light pouring through the windows. It was perfect, and underneath it, deep in the soil, it was rotting. I walked straight through the empty main room, past the small bathroom I had just retiled, and opened the back door. It led out to a narrow, weed-choked patch of dirt that bordered the municipal alleyway. I stood on the back step, looking at the ground. There were fresh tire tracks in the mud from the environmental inspector's truck, and small, neon orange utility flags staked into the earth where they had run the ground-penetrating radar. The tank was right there, beneath my feet, slowly bleeding toxic sludge into the earth for decades. My phone vibrated in my jacket pocket. I pulled it out, half expecting Miriam. The caller ID said it was Aunt Faye. Faye was my mother's younger sister. She lived in Portland and usually only called twice a year, on my birthday and at Christmas. She was a retired school administrator, a woman who treated every family conflict like a playground dispute that just needed a firm voice and a forced apology. I answered it. "Hi, Aunt Faye. What on earth is going on up there?" she asked immediately. No pleasantries. Her voice was pitched high, tight with manufactured outrage. "Your mother called me at 6 o'clock this morning in absolute hysterics. She said you're trying to send them to federal prison over some misunderstanding with Silas." I sighed, leaning against the brick exterior of the building. The blast radius Miriam had warned me about was expanding. "It's not a misunderstanding, Faye. They forged my signature on a deed transfer to sell my building. They committed federal fraud to pay off Silas's gambling debts. She said you were holding on to $1 million property just to spite them." Faye pushed back, her tone dismissive, like I was a teenager refusing to share a toy. She said, "You have an offer from some investment group that could make all of this go away, and you're refusing to sign the paperwork. Your father's blood pressure is through the roof. Are you really going to let them lose their house over this? Did she tell you the property is a toxic hazard?" I asked, keeping my voice dead calm. "Did she tell you the developer backed out because the soil is contaminated? Did she mention that the investment group only offered me $1 single for the deed just so they could hold the cleanup liability over the city's head?" There was a brief pause on the line. "Well, she said it was complicated." "It's not complicated, Faye. They stole from me. The sale collapsed. Now they owe the developer $50,000 that Silas already gave to a sportsbook. If they don't pay it back by tomorrow, the developer is pressing charges. I can't save them. Even if I wanted to, I don't have the money." "But you can sign the building over to that investor," Faye argued, clinging to the narrative my mother had spoon-fed her. "If it's toxic, you should be glad to get rid of it. If you sign it over, the investor pays the debt, and your parents stay out of jail. Why are you being so vindictive? Family is family." "Faye," I said, "if I sign it over to Duncan Mercer, he gets an $800,000 asset for $1. I lose my grandfather's legacy entirely, and the people who forged my name get a free pass. So you care more about bricks than your own mother." "I care about reality," I told her. "And the reality is, they chose Silas. They've always chosen Silas. They made their bet. Now they have to pay for it." I hung up. I didn't block Faye's number, but I muted her contact. I stood in the alleyway for a few more minutes, letting the cold air clear my head before I locked the building back up and drove home. By Thursday evening, the silence broke again. This time, it was an email from Miriam Voss. The subject line was just the parcel number. I opened it on my laptop while sitting at the kitchen island. "Petition filed and accepted by the zoning board." The email read, "The EPA mandate is officially stayed pending a municipal survey of the alleyway. The city's legal counsel has been notified that they are a liable party in the soil contamination." But that's not the only news. I scrolled down. "Duncan Mercer's group contacted my office an hour ago. They bypassed you entirely and pulled my name from the court filings. He knows about the zoning petition. He knows you locked the deed into a municipal dispute." My chest tightened. Mercer was fast. "He offered to buy the property for $50,000, Miriam wrote. "Not $1, $50,000. He says it's enough to pay off your parents' debt directly, leaving you with nothing, but keeping them out of prison. He told me to tell you that this is his final offer, and that if you decline, he is purchasing the developer's debt at 9 a.m. tomorrow and turning your brother's location over to the syndicate." I stared at the screen. $50,000. It was exactly enough to cover the earnest money, nothing more. Mercer was trying to thread the needle, offering just enough to remove the legal threat against my parents, knowing that the guilt might be enough to break me. He was betting that I would sacrifice the entire equity of the building just to stop the bleeding. "My advice remains the same," the email concluded. "Do not engage. Mercer is a scavenger. If he buys the debt, he takes on the risk of collecting it. That is his problem, not yours. Let him buy it. Let the Friday deadline hit. Call me if you need me." I closed the laptop. Friday morning felt different. The air in my apartment was completely still. I woke up at 7 a.m., made a pot of coffee, and sat by the window in my living room, watching the commuter traffic crawl along the wet streets below. Today was the day. The developer's deadline for the $50,000 was noon. If the money wasn't wired back into their escrow account by midday, their lawyers were handing the forged warranty deed and the electronic IP logs over to the federal prosecutor's office. At 8:30 a.m., my phone rang. It was an unblocked number, a local Seattle area code. I didn't recognize it, but I answered it anyway. "They're gone," a voice said. It was Silas. He wasn't whispering this time. He just sounded entirely empty. "What?" I asked. "Mom and Dad," Silas said. The background noise on his end sounded like wind and the low rumble of a ferry engine. "I went by the house this morning to see if they had managed to scrape together a loan or if they had heard from you. The house is empty." I frowned, setting my coffee mug down on the windowsill. "What do you mean empty?" "I mean their cars are gone. The safe in the hall closet is open and empty. Mom's jewelry boxes are gone. Dad's golf clubs are gone." Silas let out a dry, hacking cough. "They left a note on the kitchen counter. For me." A cold, creeping sensation moved up the back of my neck. "What did the note say, Silas?" "It said they couldn't go to prison. It said they were sorry, but that the syndicate was going to find me eventually anyway, and they couldn't be dragged down with me." Silas's voice cracked, a pathetic, broken sound. "They took whatever cash they had left, and they ran. They left me here." I closed my eyes, pressing 2 fingers against the bridge of my nose, listening to the wet, jagged sound of my brother trying to breathe through a panic attack. "Silas," I said, my voice flat, stripped of whatever residual pity I might have had left for him. "Did they take the car?" "They took the Honda," he gasped. "The truck is still here, but the plates are expired and it needs a new alternator. They took the cash from the emergency envelope. They took Mom's jewelry. They just left this stupid note." He read it again, his voice pitching higher, fracturing under the weight of the abandonment. "They said the syndicate was going to find me. They said they couldn't go down with me. They left me, man. I'm sitting in the kitchen, and the house is it's just empty." I looked at the digital clock on my microwave. It was 8:34 a.m. "You can't stay there," I told him. "The developer's deadline is noon. When the money doesn't clear the escrow account, their lawyers are going to call the federal prosecutor, and they are going to send the police to that house to look for Mom and Dad. If you are sitting there when they arrive, you are going to be arrested as an accessory to federal wire fraud." "I have nowhere to go," Silas yelled, the desperation turning instantly to entitlement. "You have to let me come over. I'll sleep on your floor. I just need a few days to figure this out." "No," I said. The silence on the line was heavy, suffocating. suffocating. No, Silas repeated, stunned. They left me to die. And you're saying no? I am saying no, I told him, enunciating every syllable. You wired $50,000 of stolen money to an offshore sports syndicate. Silas, if you come here, you bring the federal government and your bookies straight to my front door. I am already drowning in a $250,000 toxic cleanup bill because of you. I am not letting you drag me under completely. You're my brother, he whispered. Pack a bag, I said, ignoring the blatant manipulation. Take whatever is left in the house that you can sell. Electronics, tools, I don't care. Walk to the bus stop on 145th. Ride it downtown and walk into the police precinct. Tell them everything. Tell them about the forgery. Tell them about the money. Tell them about the syndicate. If you are in police custody, the people you owe money to can't touch you. It's the only safe place you have left. I didn't wait for his response. I pulled the phone away from my ear and ended the call. Then I went into my settings and blocked the number. I stood in my kitchen for a long time, watching the rain start to streak against the glass of the window. My parents had run. They had packed their bags in the middle of the night, looked at the mess they had made of our lives, and simply walked away. They had sacrificed my grandfather's legacy to save their favorite son, and when that failed, they had sacrificed the son to save themselves. At 8:45 a.m., I called Miriam Voss. She picked up on the second ring. Tell me you didn't talk to Duncan Mercer, she said by way of a greeting. I didn't talk to Mercer, I said. I talked to Silas. My parents fled. I heard the scratch of a pen on paper stop abruptly. Define fled. They emptied their safe, took the cash in the car, and left Silas a note saying they couldn't go to prison. They abandoned the house. Miriam let out a slow, heavy breath. Well, that accelerates the timeline significantly. Flight is a tacit admission of guilt. The developers' lawyers won't even wait until noon now. The moment I notify them that the primary targets have fled the jurisdiction, they will refer the case to the U.S. Attorney's Office. Your parents just turned a civil breach of contract and a white-collar fraud investigation into a federal manhunt. What does that mean for the building? I asked. It means the $50,000 is permanently gone, Miriam said, clinically. Your parents don't have it, and Silas gave it to a bookie, which means the developer is holding a worthless debt. They want to be made whole, and they want it fast. Mercer, I realized. Exactly. Mercer is going to buy that debt this morning. He probably already has. The developer will sell it to him for pennies on the dollar just to get it off their books and claim the tax loss. And once Mercer owns that debt, he is going to pivot his entire strategy. Miriam paused, and I could hear her tapping her keyboard. He can't use Silas against you anymore, because your parents already abandoned him. The emotional leverage is gone, so Mercer is going to come after the title of your building. How? I asked. My parents forged the deed. They didn't have the legal authority to sell it. The sale is void. It's void, Miriam agreed. But your parents signed the preliminary brokerage contract claiming to be your legal representatives. It's a fraudulent claim, but it ties your name to the initial transaction. Mercer is going to file a lis pendens, a notice of pending legal action, against your property's title. He's going to claim that because the earnest money was issued under the assumption of a valid sale, the $50,000 debt is attached to the equity of the building itself. Can he do that? I asked, my grip tightening on the phone. He can file it, Miriam said. We can fight it in court and eventually get it dismissed because the fraud is documented. But getting a judge to formally strip a lis pendens takes months, sometimes a year. And while it sits on your title, the building is legally frozen. You can't sell your half. You can't take out a loan against it to pay for the environmental cleanup. You are completely paralyzed. I looked out the window at the gray Seattle skyline. Every time I thought I found a way to stop the bleeding, a new artery opened up. What about the city? We filed the zoning petition yesterday to freeze the EPA mandate. Does that buy me time? It buys us a temporary stay on the environmental fines, Miriam said. The city has to send a municipal surveyor out to look at the alleyway and determine if the tank actually crosses the property line. Bureaucracy moves slow. We probably have a few weeks before they even assign a case manager. My phone vibrated against my ear. Another call was coming in. I pulled the screen away and looked at the caller ID. It was a 206 area code. The caller ID read, City of Seattle Depth of Ecology. Miriam, I said, putting the phone back to my ear. Bureaucracy isn't moving slow. The Department of Ecology is calling me right now. Don't agree to anything, Miriam ordered instantly. Take notes. Get a name. Call me back. I clicked over to the other line. Hello? Am I speaking with the primary deed holder of the commercial property on 4th Avenue? A voice asked. It was a male voice, dry, exhausted, and carrying the distinct nasal tone of someone who spent their life reading code violations. Yes, you are, I said. My name is Garrett Ashby. I'm a senior site inspector with the Municipal Environmental Abatement Division, the man said. I'm calling regarding an emergency zoning petition filed by your legal counsel yesterday afternoon. Right, I said carefully. The petition regarding the heating oil tank encroaching on the municipal alleyway. Yes, Garrett Ashby said. I'm currently standing in the alleyway behind your building. I need you to come down here and unlock the rear gate so I can access the foundation line. I have a municipal mandate to physically verify the ground-penetrating radar report you submitted. You're there right now? I asked, startled. I was told it would take weeks to schedule a survey. Normally, it does, Garrett replied, his tone devoid of any customer service polish. But when a private citizen attempts to shift a $250,000 hazardous waste liability onto the city of Seattle, the city attorney's office tends to expedite the verification process. Can you be here in 20 minutes, or do I need to call a locksmith and bill your property tax account? I'll be there, I said, and hung up. I grabbed my keys and my jacket and took the stairs down to the parking garage 2 at a time. The drive downtown took exactly 18 minutes. I pulled my truck into the loading zone in front of the studio and walked around to the alleyway. Garrett Ashby was a tall, severely thin man in his late 50s. He was wearing a high-visibility yellow vest over a gray fleece jacket, holding a waterproof tablet, and standing directly over the muddy tire tracks left by the developer's inspector 2 days ago. He didn't look up when I approached. He just kept tapping the screen of his tablet. Mr. Ashby? I asked. He finally looked up, squinting at me through rain-streaked glasses. You the owner? I am, I said, pulling my keys out to unlock the heavy iron gate that separated my small rear footprint from the public alley. I pushed it open. The radar anomaly is right there, near the brick foundation. Garrett walked through the gate, stepping carefully over the weeds. He didn't look at the foundation first. He looked at the orange utility flags the previous inspector had left in the dirt. Then, he raised his tablet and looked at the back wall of my studio. He spent a solid minute just staring at the brickwork, comparing it to whatever schematic he had on his screen. Your lawyer filed a petition claiming the city is liable for this contamination because the tank rests partially on municipal land, Garrett said, his voice entirely conversational, which somehow made it worse. The radar report shows the tank crosses the property line, I said, repeating Miriam's argument. Under state law, liability is determined by whose land land the hazard occupies. That is generally true, Garrett said. He tapped a button on his tablet and turned the screen around to show me a scanned, black and white architectural drawing. The lines were faint, drafted by hand. This is the original municipal plot map for this block, filed in 1952. Look at the rear property line for your parcel. I looked at the screen. The drawing showed a perfect rectangle. The rear property line ended exactly 10 feet away from the back wall of the building. Garrett swiped his finger, pulling up a second document. This one was a municipal building permit from 1974, bearing my grandfather's signature. In 1974, your grandfather filed a permit to expand the rear storage room of his hardware store, Garrett explained. He extended the back wall of the building outward by 8 feet. Do you see the problem? I looked at the distance between the current brick wall and the alleyway. It was barely 2 feet. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the sternum. He built over the lot line, I whispered. No, Garrett corrected, putting his tablet back under his arm to protect it from the drizzle. He built right up to the edge of his property line, which means he didn't have any room left on his own land to bury the new heating oil tank required for the expansion. Garrett pointed a gloved finger down at the muddy ground where the orange flags sat. Your grandfather didn't just accidentally let a tank cross the property line. He actively excavated municipal property. He buried a 500-gallon steel tank in a public alleyway without a permit, paved over it with gravel, and never disclosed it to the city. The tank doesn't just rest on city land. It is entirely an illegal municipal encroachment. I stood there in the rain, staring at the dirt. My grandfather, the man who had warned me about my parents' lack of integrity, the man who had handed me the deed with trembling, calloused hands, had built his legacy on a foundation of cut corners and quiet deceptions. First, the silent bailout from Vivian Harlow. Now this. So the city isn't liable, I said, the words tasting like copper. The city is absolutely not liable, Garrett said flatly. In fact, because your grandfather illegally dumped a hazardous storage container on municipal property, the indemnification protections you thought you had are void. The Department of Ecology is rejecting your zoning petition. He reached into his fleece jacket, pulled out a thick, plastic-wrapped envelope, and handed it to me. This is a formal notice of violation and a mandated abatement order, Garrett said. You have 30 days to submit a certified remediation plan to the city, at your own expense. If a contractor hasn't broken ground to remove that tank and the contaminated soil in 31 days, the city of Seattle will place a municipal lien on the property, seize it under environmental eminent domain, and auction it to a commercial developer to cover the cleanup costs. I took the envelope. It felt impossibly heavy. And the fines? Since it's an illegal encroachment, Garrett adjusted his glasses. There is a retroactive municipal penalty for unauthorized use of public land, plus a hazardous dumping fine. The total penalty is $42,000. It is due in 90 days. Have a good morning. Garrett Ashby turned around, walked back to his white municipal fleet car parked down the block, and drove away. I stood alone in the alleyway behind my building, holding the plastic-wrapped envelope. The rain was coming down harder now, soaking through the shoulders of my denim jacket. My parents were gone. Silas was trapped. The Vivian Harlow Trust was waiting for me to fail, and my grandfather's gift had just mutated into a ticking clock that would bankrupt me in exactly 30 days. I walked back around to the front of the studio. I just wanted to get in my truck. I wanted to turn the heater on and sit in the quiet. But there was a man standing next to the driver's side door of my truck. He wasn't Duncan Mercer. Mercer had sounded polished, sharp, and wealthy on the phone. This man looked like a line cook who had borrowed a suit that didn't quite fit. He was holding a manila folder, sheltering it against his chest to keep the rain off the cardboard. I stopped on the sidewalk. Can I help you? Are you the legal owner of this vehicle? The man asked, reading my license plate number off a piece of paper taped to the front of the folder. Yes. And you are the primary deed holder of the commercial parcel at this address? He gestured his head toward the brick storefront. Yes, I said, the cold dread creeping back up my spine. Who are you? Process server, the man said. He took one step forward, slapped the manila folder flat against the driver's side window of my truck, and let it slide down onto the wet asphalt. You've been served. He didn't wait for a reaction. He just turned around, walked across the street, got into a gray sedan, and drove off. I picked the folder up off the ground. The cardboard was already turning dark with the rain. I opened it and pulled out the legal filing inside. Miriam had been right about the lis pendens. Mercer had bought the debt, but she had been entirely wrong about his strategy. Mercer didn't file the lien against the title of the building. I read the top line of the court document, the words blurring slightly as the rain hit the paper. It was a civil lawsuit filed in the Superior Court of King County. The plaintiff was Mercer's private investment group. The defendants listed were my mother, my father, and me. I flipped to the second page, scanning the dense legal jargon until I found the cause of action. Mercer's lawyers weren't arguing that the $50,000 debt was attached to the building. They were arguing that I was a co-conspirator in the fraud. Plaintiff alleges that the primary deed holder actively colluded with the aforementioned family members to fraudulently induce the preliminary sale, accepting a $50,000 earnest money deposit with the express prior knowledge of undisclosed environmental hazards, intending to void the contract after the funds were secured and subsequently laundered through offshore syndicates. I stared at the paper. They were accusing me of being in on it. They were claiming that the forged signature wasn't a forgery at all, but a coordinated family scheme to steal $50,000 from a rapid development firm, using my brother's gambling debts as a smokescreen to move the money out of the country. They weren't trying to freeze the building's title. They were suing me personally for fraud, breach of contract, and punitive damages exceeding $300,000. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out. It was Duncan Mercer. I answered it, putting the phone to my ear, my eyes still locked on the lawsuit in my hand. Good morning, Duncan said, his voice as smooth and unbothered as it had been yesterday. I assume my courier found you? You're suing me for fraud, I said, my voice dangerously quiet. You know I didn't sign that deed. I know you say you didn't sign that deed, Duncan corrected pleasantly. But your parents have conveniently fled the jurisdiction. Your brother is unreachable. You are the only member of the family left standing, holding a toxic property you can't afford to clean up, and $50,000 is missing. A jury is going to look at that timeline. Look at your grandfather's history of undocumented municipal hazard dumping. Yes, we know about the permit from 1974. My people are very thorough, and they are going to see a family with a long history of financial deception. It's a baseless suit, I said. Miriam will get it thrown out. Eventually, perhaps, Duncan agreed. But civil discovery takes a year. Can you afford your lawyer's hourly rate for a year? Can you afford to fight me in court while simultaneously paying the city of Seattle $42,000 in fines? Can you afford the $250,000 abatement that is due in 30 days before the city seizes the asset anyway? He paused, letting the sheer, crushing crushing weight of the math settle over me. You are out of moves, Duncan said. You tried to play the city against the trust, and it backfired. You tried to call my bluff, and I bought the debt. You are holding a lit stick of dynamite. What do you want? I asked, the fight draining out of me, leaving only a hollow, echoing exhaustion. The offer has changed, Duncan said. Yesterday, I offered you $1 for the deed. Today, I am offering you nothing. Sign the primary deed over to my holding company by 5:00 p.m. Today, if you do, I will assume the municipal fines, I will assume the environmental liability, and I will drop the civil fraud suit against you with prejudice. I walk away with nothing, I said. I lose the building, I lose the equity, and I get nothing. You get your life back, Duncan replied. You get to walk away without a bankruptcy filing and a civil fraud judgment on your record. The deed transfer paperwork is already sitting in your lawyer's inbox. Tell Miriam to review it. Have it signed and notarized by 5. He hung up. I lowered the phone and stared at the dark screen. I didn't throw it into the street. I didn't scream. I just stood in the rain, looking at the soaked cardboard folder in my hand, and let the sheer, arrogant confidence of Duncan Mercer's ultimatum wash over me. He thought he had me backed into a corner. He thought the weight of the city, the trust, and my own family's crimes would simply crush me into submission by 5 o'clock. I got back into my truck, turned the heater on full blast, and tossed the lawsuit onto the passenger seat. I didn't drive to a notary. I drove straight back to Miriam Voss's office. She was sitting at her cluttered desk, eating a lukewarm bagel and reading a legal brief when I walked in, dripping wet. I didn't say a word. I just picked up the civil suit from the folder and dropped it directly on top of her lunch, followed by the plastic-wrapped mandated abatement order from the city. Miriam wiped her fingers on a napkin, adjusted her glasses, and picked up the lawsuit. She read the plaintiff's name, then flipped to the cause of action. Her eyes scanned the dense paragraphs, her expression unreadable. He's suing you for conspiracy to commit fraud, Miriam said, her voice dry. He's alleging you were a willing participant in the forgery, that you accepted the earnest money with full knowledge of the environmental hazard, and that your parents fleeing the jurisdiction was a coordinated exit strategy. He told me he'll drop it if I sign the deed over by 5, I said, pulling up a chair and sitting down heavily. If I don't, I have to fight a multi-$100,000 civil suit while simultaneously paying the city a $42,000 fine and managing a $250,000 cleanup in the next 30 days. Miriam set the lawsuit down and picked up the city mandate. She flipped through Garrett Ashby's report, lingering on the 1974 permit my grandfather had signed. Your grandfather was a piece of work, she murmured. He built to the property line and buried the tank in the municipal alley, I said, the exhaustion finally bleeding into my voice. The city isn't liable for a dime. In 30 days, they place a lien on the property and seize it under environmental eminent domain to auction it off. Mercer knows this. He's banking on me realizing I can't afford any of it. Miriam leaned back in her chair and steepled her fingers. She looked at the lawsuit, then at the city mandate, and finally at me. Where is your brother right now? She asked. The question threw me. What? Silas, Miriam said. You told me this morning that your parents abandoned him and you told him to go to the police. Did he? I looked at the clock on her wall. It was just past 11. I don't know. I blocked his number right after I hung up. Unblock it, Miriam ordered, sliding her desk phone toward me. Call the downtown precinct. Ask for the fraud division. I pulled out my cell phone, found the number for the Seattle Police Department's downtown headquarters, and navigated the automated menu until I was transferred to the white-collar crimes desk. A man answered, identifying himself as Detective Reed. Detective, my name is, I hesitated, glancing at Miriam. She nodded encouragingly. I gave him my full name. I'm calling to see if my brother Silas came in this morning. There was a long pause on the other end, accompanied by the sound of shuffling papers. You're the brother, Detective Reed said, his tone instantly shifting from bureaucratic boredom to sharp professional interest. We were just about to call you. Yes, he's here. He walked in about 2 hours ago. He's currently in an interview room. Has he given a statement? Miriam asked, leaning over her desk to speak loudly enough for the phone's microphone to pick it up. This is Miriam Voss. I am legal counsel for the brother. He gave a full recorded confession. Detective Reed confirmed. He detailed a wire fraud scheme involving a forged warranty deed, an offshore sports syndicate, and the theft of a $50,000 earnest money deposit. He also provided a handwritten note left by your parents this morning, indicating their flight from the jurisdiction. We've just issued active federal warrants for their arrest. I felt the air leave my lungs. It was real. The threat, the chase, the endless cycle of my parents bailing him out. It was finally over. The machinery of consequences had finally locked its jaws around them. Detective, Miriam said, her voice practically purring. In his recorded statement, did Silas indicate that my client had any prior knowledge of or participation in the forgery or the theft of the funds? He explicitly stated your client was completely unaware, Reed said. He said they bypassed your client's two-factor authentication without his knowledge. As far as this department and the U.S. Attorney's Office are concerned, your client is the primary victim of identity theft. Thank you, Detective, Miriam said. My client will be fully cooperative with your investigation moving forward. I hung up the phone. The silence in the office felt entirely different now. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of a trap. It was the clear, sharp silence of an open door. Miriam picked up Mercer's lawsuit and tossed it casually into her recycling bin. Duncan Mercer just made a fatal tactical error, Miriam said, a genuine predatory smile breaking across her face. He filed a civil suit claiming you are a co-conspirator in a fraud, but the actual perpetrator just went on the federal record, explicitly exonerating you. The police report legally establishes you as the victim of identity theft. So the lawsuit is dead, I said. It's worse than dead, Miriam corrected. It's extortion under the color of civil litigation. Mercer filed a frivolous slap suit to coerce a real estate transfer. I am going to email his legal team right now. I am going to attach the police incident number, and I am going to inform them that if this lawsuit isn't withdrawn with prejudice by 4 o'clock today, I will file a motion for severe judicial sanctions, a countersuit for malicious prosecution, and I will forward the recording of his extortionate phone call to the state bar. She pulled her keyboard toward her and started typing with terrifying speed. Mercer is a vulture, but vultures aren't stupid. They don't fight battles they are guaranteed to lose, and they don't risk their legal licenses over a single property. He bought a $50,000 debt from the developer, and now he is stuck with it. The only people he can collect it from are 2 fugitives currently running from the FBI. He is entirely out of the picture. I watched her hit send on the email. Half the weight on my chest vanished, but the other half remained, anchored by the plastic-wrapped envelope sitting on her desk. That still leaves the city, I pointed out quietly. Mercer is gone, but the mandate isn't. I still owe $42,000 in fines, and I still have 29 days to find $250,000 to dig up that alleyway, or the city takes the building anyway. alleyway. Miriam, stop typing. She looked at the abatement order, and then she looked at me. The Vivian Harlow Trust, she said. Ingrid said they won't pay a dime, I reminded her. The indemnification clause shields them from all municipal liabilities and fines. She told me she would just sit back, let the city foreclose, and write off the loss. She told you that when she thought the city was just placing a standard lien, Miriam corrected, tapping her pen against the desk. She didn't know about the 1974 permit. She didn't know your grandfather illegally dumped a hazardous container onto municipal land. Why does that matter? Because an environmental eminent domain seizure isn't a standard foreclosure, Miriam explained, her eyes bright with the legal geometry of the situation. When the city seizes a property to abate an illegal municipal encroachment, it executes a hard wipe of the title to clear the lot for public auction. It extinguishes all subordinate claims, all of them. She leaned forward. Ingrid's indemnification clause shields the trust from being billed for the cleanup. It does not shield the trust from losing its equity in the seizure. If that building goes to auction, the Vivian Harlow Trust doesn't just take a tax loss. They lose their 49% stake entirely, with zero compensation. A $400,000 asset evaporates. I sat back, the math slowly clicking into place. You need to go back to Bellevue, Miriam said softly, and you need to explain the new reality to her. I left Miriam's office at 1 o'clock. The traffic across the floating bridge was light, the Seattle rain finally breaking into a pale, watery afternoon sun. By the time I walked into the sterile, lemon-scented reception area of Halvorsen and Strand, I didn't bother asking for an appointment. I just stood at the desk until the receptionist paged Ingrid. She walked into the lobby 5 minutes later, wearing the same sharp navy blazer, looking thoroughly annoyed. I told you yesterday, we have nothing further to discuss regarding the property. We need the conference room, I said, my voice leaving no room for negotiation. She studied my face for a second, saw something she hadn't seen yesterday, and silently turned, leading me into the glass-walled room. I didn't sit down. I opened the manila folder I had carried in and slid the mandated abatement order across the polished mahogany table. The city inspector came out this morning, I told her, watching her eyes drop to the plastic-wrapped document. They pulled the 1974 building permits. The tank isn't just leaking into the municipal alleyway. My grandfather buried it entirely on city property. It's an illegal encroachment. The Department of Ecology just issued a 30-day eminent domain mandate. Ingrid frowned, picking up the document and flipping to the second page. This is unfortunate for you. But as I explained yesterday, the trust's indemnification clause shields you from being fined, I interrupted, placing both hands flat on the table and leaning in. I know, the city billed me $42,000 for the retroactive permit violations. I am legally responsible for that. But you need to read the seizure clause on page 3, Ingrid. She turned the page. I watched her eyes track back and forth across the dense legal text. I watched the moment her clinical detachment fractured, replaced by the cold, hard realization of a fiduciary staring at a total loss. Eminent domain, I said quietly, filling the silence in the room. If a remediation contractor hasn't broken ground in 29 days, the city seizes the title. They wipe it completely clean to sell at a brownfield auction. My 51% is gone, and your 49% is gone. Poof, your indemnification clause doesn't protect your equity from a municipal wipe. Ingrid slowly lowered the paperwork. She took her glasses off and pinched the bridge of her nose. What do you want? I want to keep my building, I said. Duncan Mercer tried to extort me for the deed this morning. My lawyer just crushed his civil suit because my brother confessed to the forgery on the federal record. Mercer is out. My parents are fugitives. The only people left on the board are you, me, and the city of Seattle. I pulled a second piece of paper from my folder, a printed quote from a commercial abatement firm Miriam had recommended. I set it next to the city mandate. The cleanup is going to cost $250,000, I told her. I am going to take out a commercial loan against my equity to pay the $42,000 city fine, but I don't have the cash for the abatement. The trust does. Ingrid looked at the quote. You expect the trust to fund the entire abatement? I expect the trust to protect its investment, I corrected. If you write a check for the $250,000, the mandate is lifted. The building retains its value. We lease out the front retail space to cover the trust's return on investment, and I keep the back half as my private studio. You secure a steady, clean revenue stream for the Harlow estate, and you don't have to explain to your partners how you let $500,000 of equity get seized by the city. Ingrid stared at the papers on the table for a long, silent minute. The Bellevue skyline loomed behind her through the glass, cold and indifferent. She was running the numbers, weighing the cost of the cleanup against the total loss of the asset. Finally, she put her glasses back on. I will have our legal department draft a joint venture remediation agreement by tomorrow morning, Ingrid said, her voice brisk. The negotiation entirely over. The trust will release the funds directly to the abatement contractor upon city approval of the permits. You will handle all municipal logistics and physical oversight of the site. Agreed, I said. She extended her hand. It was the first time she had done so. I shook it. Her grip was firm, entirely professional, devoid of any warmth. It was exactly the kind of partnership I needed. I walked out of the office and drove back across the bridge to Seattle. When I parked my truck across the street from the studio, the sun was beginning to set, casting long, deep shadows across the red brick facade. I crossed the wet pavement, unlocked the heavy oak door, and stepped inside. The air was still cold, smelling of ancient dust and the faint scent of rain bleeding through the old window frames. I walked slowly across the hardwood floors I had spent 3 years sanding down. I went to the back door, unlocked it, and stepped out onto the concrete stoop. The alleyway was empty. The neon orange utility flags fluttered slightly in the evening breeze, marking the toxic legacy my grandfather had buried in the dirt. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out. It was a text from Miriam. Mercer's lawyers just officially withdrew the lawsuit with prejudice. He's done. I read the text twice, letting the finality of it settle into my bones. Then, I put the phone back in my jacket. My parents were gone, driving a stolen Honda toward a border they would eventually be caught at. Silas was sitting in a federal holding cell, finally facing the consequences he had spent a lifetime outrunning. They had broken themselves against their own greed, and in the process, they had nearly broken me. But I was still standing. I looked back inside the studio, at the high arched windows and the solid brick walls. It wasn't the pristine, unburdened inheritance I had thought it was. It was complicated. It was fractured. It was tied to a cold corporate trust, and anchored by a mistake I would spend the next year physically digging out of the mud. It wasn't free and clear, but as I stepped back inside and locked the door behind me, the heavy deadbolt sliding into place with a satisfying metallic click, I knew one thing for certain. It was mine.